noticed. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth to make some introductory remarks. We can't hear you, Elizabeth, for some reason. We can't hear you, Elizabeth. I'm not sure why.
Is that better?
That's better, yes.
Sorry, everyone, that's a good start. So I'm a lawyer at Freshfields Brickhouse Derringer law firm, where I'm part of the Global Business and Human Rights Group. And as part of that group, I regularly advise clients on legal developments in this space, so business and human rights, what the emerging legal risks are for companies, often large multinationals with global supply chains, and including how they can comply with incoming human rights due diligence legislation. And there's a lot happening in this space at the moment. It's been gathering pace for the last sort of 10 years or so. And in the last 12 months in particular, we've seen a number of really material developments in the world of human rights due diligence legislation. In particular, the introduction or incoming EU mandatory due diligence legislation that should be introduced later this year. A similar piece of legislation due to be introduced in Germany, and this already builds on a growing body of laws that we've been seeing sort of once a year. We've been seeing a new jurisdiction introducing a new law. So it's really exciting to see all of these developments happening, but obviously it presents challenges for companies who are trying to keep up, particularly ones that operate in different jurisdictions where several different laws might impact their operations. And also, each of these laws is slightly different. So some have a very specific focus on things like modern slavery, others are much broader and they encompass general human rights issues and even environmental issues. So that's a challenge for companies as well. But I suppose the key trend that all of these laws demonstrate is that these issues and how companies should be addressing the human rights impacts of their operations is really moving out of what was previously the sort of voluntary CSR space and firmly into mandatory obligations and legal compliance issues. So it's very firmly getting the attention of the board, of investors, shareholders, and I expect that we'll see a lot more of that in the next few years. So I'm looking forward to, in this session, discussing how companies can stay on the front foot and see what they can do to stay ahead of this wave of legislation that's being introduced.
Okay, Elizabeth, thank you very much indeed. Phil, over to you. Your opening thoughts.
Oh, good. I'm already unmuted.
Excellent.
Thank
well
you.
Done.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks to the Innovation Forum. So I'm Phil Bloomer and from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. I've really got three key messages. Firstly, the laws are coming. Secondly, it's much better for companies and their brands to be ahead of the curve in terms of their preparations and what they can do about it. And then thirdly, that they need to get on the right side regarding the legislation and the shaping of that legislation. So firstly, in terms of laws are coming, I mean, many laws have already come, from the Dutch to the French through to, as Elizabeth was mentioning, the German law, which has just been announced, the Norwegian efforts that are imminent, as well as the European Union. And I think they'll also be reinforced by the growth of ESG investment portfolios. Why is this happening? Well, it's happening, I think, because it's because the scale of inequality is now perceived as unsustainable. And of course, there's climate breakdown on top of that. But the centre-right and centre-left political parties are deeply worried by the shift towards populist politicians. And so they feel the need to be able to start to ensure that the values of our societies are better represented in regulation, in law, and business incentives, to make sure that those values are genuinely respected in terms of rights and the due diligence in companies' operations as well as value chains. So with that is also going to come a stiffening in terms of a focus on liability and sanctions.
Oh dear, we may find out what the second half of that sentence was in a moment.
Commissioner has said that regulation would nudge politics, etc. Then we're also going to get Can you still hear me?
Yes,
No.
you just froze for a moment, that's all.
Oh, sorry. Good. So this is not likely to go away anytime soon, but I believe this is good news for responsible fashion brands. It creates a level playing field, it creates greater legal certainty, and it creates harmonization. So the point now is for companies, particularly better companies, to get ahead of the curve. To do that, I think brands must avoid the descent into tick box exercises, compliance-driven approaches of social audits and clauses in contracts. Leading companies, of course, use those, but they use them in effective ways. But they're also transforming their purchasing practices by building longer-term relationships of trust and resilience with suppliers. And that's been respected by investors who've seen those companies actually perform better through the turbulence of the pandemic, but have also seen workers' rights in those supply chains better respected. So the straightforward social audits and compliance clauses as we've known them have lost an enormous amount of credibility. And they're now seen, I believe, by many as providing little more than plausible deniability or a fig leaf for continued abuse, the tolerance of abuse of workers. So what needs to change? Well, we believe, firstly, it's going to take leadership. So the companies, when they introduce their due diligence, need to make sure that it's the leadership in the boards that are responsible for that. Secondly, it's about right holders' engagement, about the workers themselves. Without them, there is no effective due diligence in supply chains. Continuous regular engagement with workers is necessary, and brands' due diligence approaches will be far stronger if they're designed and implemented and verified with workers themselves. Without them, to be honest, I think brands will likely create a dangerous fiction which will not stand up to scrutiny, especially in any court. So there's those areas that are going to be necessary, and I think also greater disclosure in terms of transparency. Finally, I'll just say the companies that will be influential will be those that are on the right side of the legislation, seeking to help shape effective mandatory due diligence, an effective remedy. We have worked with Shift, the Resource Centre has worked with Shift and many others, many companies to gain statements. We now have hundreds of companies across Europe speaking out in favour of the legislation, and we've just yesterday issued a statement by 50 German companies, not only speaking out in favour of the German legislation, but also saying that it needs to be stronger. So I'll leave it there and we can come back to some discussion. Thank you.
Cheers, Phil. Thanks very much indeed for that. And I like the plausible deniability and dangerous fiction. I think that's always the risk, that it gets dealt with at the top level, but doesn't really, the rubber never really hits the road. I think those are very important points. So we now come to our third speaker, Tessel van Vesten, who is from the Responsible Business Conduct Unit at the Dutch Foreign Ministry. I'm not even going to try and say that in Dutch. So Tessel, over to you for some introductory remarks, as the other two speakers have done.
Thanks so much for having me, and my apologies for being a bit late. I had some technical difficulties, but I'm here now, so happy to join you all for this good discussion. So being ahead of the curve, I think that's what we're trying to do in the Netherlands as well. We started our voluntary agreements in 2014, especially the textile and clothing sector was one of the front runners in that aspect. So I think they are also trying to stay ahead of the curve and trying to really be seen as front runners and be active as front runners. So I think it's very important to focus on that and to support companies in doing their due diligence and to support them to work collectively on doing due diligence. So that's what we've been trying to do for a couple of years now. So not just with the textile sector, but also with the financial sector and the food industry and all these different sectors. We've also done an evaluation of our policies, of our voluntary approach of due diligence, supporting due diligence amongst companies. So we've seen the need for legislation because we've seen that only a few front-runner sectors and companies are really actively engaging and doing their due diligence properly, but we also see a lot of laggards, a lot of sectors that are not doing what they are supposed to be doing. So that's why the Dutch government said that we need legislation, but preferably EU legislation and not just national legislation. So I'm very curious to see what this discussion will bring on how we can support companies to adhere to legislation and perhaps go a bit further also than not just doing their due diligence, checking the boxes, but also having more impact in value chains and really addressing these issues.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, I've got a couple of questions which I'm going to sort of get the discussion started with, but those of you in the audience wanting to ask questions, there's either the chat box you can use, or if you've got your camera on, you can raise a hand. So either of those work, and I'll try and bring questions, as many questions from the floor as I can. But I think that the first question I'd like to sort of put to the panel is, how do you actually get companies to engage? I mean, all the way through this, I suppose, sustainability journey, all the way from when it was sort of CSR, all the way through to where we are now, there's always been, you know, a set of companies who engage with these issues proactively and upfront, and others that come along kicking and screaming, if ever. How do we actually get companies to engage? Also, how do we get to the point where, to use Phil's expression, we don't just end up with another form of plausible deniability? How do we get companies to actually operationalize these things? And how do we avoid some of the potential negative externalities? For example, looking at smallholder supply chains, you know, buying from large plantations where crops are grown. I'm sorry, I'm mixing industries here, I realize, but because it's easier to verify, to be sure what you're getting into, rather than perhaps some smallholder farmers where things are much more diffuse and difficult. How do you engage companies in taking that stage of the journey, rather than just it being another a slightly more complicated tick box exercise? Looking at the three panelists, who wants to kick off? Phil's grinning most inanely, so I'll go to him first. Phil, over to you.
So rude.
I do my best.
No, thanks. That's a great question. I think I'd just say I mean, you know, I worked on these issues for many years, perhaps even decades, but to my mind, you know, companies are like any other organization. They respond to threats and they respond to incentives and opportunities. And I think that's why, when we've seen the voluntary approach fail, we're now fail to do anything but move a significant but small cluster of companies who've led the way in so much of this, and they need to be recognized. But it's failed to bring the majority with you. And anybody can look at the work that we've done on the corporate human rights benchmark or the Know the Chain benchmark just on modern slavery to see that there's always a small cluster of companies that are out there leading the way, showing what's possible, what's commercially viable, as well as a moral imperative, and the very large number of companies that are doing very little to expunge the worst of abuse from their supply chains. So legal risk is being introduced in order for legal counsel inside companies to start to say to the board, I'm sorry, but you now face substantial legal risk if you continue with these approaches that make no effort to expunge the worst of abuse from your operations and supply chains. And so far, what we've had from many of our colleagues in the companies, human rights and sustainability officers, to say, when I go in, there's legal counsel on one side and me on the other. The CEO says, what do I do? I'm faced with an allegation of abuse. Legal counsel says, basically, we're never going to be, there's no legal risk to this, so we must carry on as we are because we can make larger revenues out of it by continuing to not pay the wages that are due, for instance. The other thing to say, though, and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States is a great example of where, you know, corruption was accepted for years and years and years. When the law came in and it had stiff penalties and liability, corruption has been essentially massively reduced, put it that way, if not expunged. But the incentives are also vital. And that's why a lot of the governments are paying special attention to making sure that government contracts for services and products are available to companies that are doing more of the right thing. And I think that's also a key part of this effort. But I'll finish. And just on the smallholder, the equivalent here is obviously the small and medium-sized enterprise. I do think it's important to know that in places like Germany, it's often the small and medium-sized enterprises that are the most outspoken for these laws, because they see themselves as being able to take much more advantage of this, because their supply chains are shorter, and therefore they can make sure there's much more guarantee. So I'll finish there.
Thanks, Phil. That's very interesting. I think at that point one has to go over to the lawyer and say, obviously you can't give specific examples, although I suspect it would be extremely interesting if you could. But it would be interesting to get some sense of how, what Phil is suggesting, what that looks like from the legal perspective. Is that beginning to be the shape of the discussions that you're having with some of the clients that you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I've noticed over the last few years is that even where a piece of human rights due diligence legislation, for example, is relatively limited in terms of the obligations it imposes, so for example, it could just be a reporting obligation like the Modern Slavery Act, even where the obligation is quite limited, what is happening is that this legislation is acting as a catalyst for these discussions to take place. So now that it has the board's attention, it's now starting off this dialogue throughout the rest of the company. And that might be not just in the legal department, but also procurement teams, audit teams. It's becoming more embedded into the general risk management processes in the company. And so in that way, I think, the optimistic view is that these pieces of legislation that are being introduced is having a wider effect than perhaps initially intended originally. However, I completely agree that there's still a long way to go before many companies see it as more than just a box ticking exercise. And we have seen some brilliant clients who have very enthusiastically been saying, okay, so we're definitely complying with our obligations, but we want to do more. And partly why they're saying that is because they want to stay ahead of the game, because they think more obligations are going to be introduced. But that has been one positive effect of the legislation, I think. In terms of how you stop it from being a box ticking exercise, I think that's quite difficult, because if the question is, are we complying with our legal obligations, then the lawyer's job is to say yes or no in very simple terms. So I think quite often it becomes, this is where it's really important to have other influences. So civil society's influence, the influence of investors. I know a lot more investors are now scrutinizing what companies are doing in terms of human rights due diligence. So I think all of those forces combined, and it's really been picking up in the last few years with the number of investors in particular who are saying that we care about this now. I think all of that together is going to be what really drives the impact, and that you can't really rely on legislation on its own. I think that's going to be a slower process, not least for the obvious reasons that it takes a long time to drive new legislation and to bring it into force.
Great, thanks. Tessa, I mean, how are you, Dutch companies, sorry, this is a horrible generalization, but Holland and Dutch companies have tended to be in the forefront of these things. How do you deal with those who are perhaps more reticent?
Yeah, so from 2014, we had the voluntary approach. I myself have spoken to a lot of companies and a lot of sector organizations on this topic, and a lot of them were very reluctant to do anything or to come to a voluntary approach. So that was quite interesting talks. And now I see with the threat of legislation, all of a sudden these companies approach me again after all these years. So I already see an incentive there. We don't even have legislation yet, but just the threat of upcoming legislation already gets them moving. So for me, that's a very good sign. So I approach them very happily and try to give them as much support as I can on doing their due diligence and starting with due diligence. So I think that's a very important thing that I'm seeing right now, that just the threat of legislation is already a very big incentive to start. But then again, I also see that these companies, they're quite willing to start, but they don't quite know how. And I think we need to be very mindful of that. We really need to support them also in doing proper due diligence and really understanding what the OECD guidelines and UN guiding principles are actually saying. And what does it mean? What does prioritization mean? How can you be transparent? All these type of things that to make sure it's not a check the box exercise, we really need to have other instruments there as well, not just legislation. And that's why we offer a smart policy mix of also supporting companies and have other incentives there to get them going, but going on in a proper way and not just doing a check the box exercise. So I think it's very important not just to focus on legislation. It's a very good instrument, and I think we really need it at this point. Our evaluation has shown that. But we need a broader range of instruments for companies to really do good due diligence.
That's an interesting point. It's seeing the legal requirements in a wider context. I mean, that then leads on to another sort of set of issues or question, which is a lot of the issues we talk about, be that child labor, be that, you know, whatever it happens to be, aren't necessarily themselves caused by international supply chains. They reflect systemic challenges in those host societies. What else might be valuable, coming back to that question about support to companies, that is around perhaps political support, that when an issue is found which is systemic in that country, that there's a support mechanism? I'm thinking particularly of the apparel sector in Bangladesh, where, you know, a significant challenge tends to be that a large number of factory owners are themselves members of the Bangladeshi parliament, and that therefore, for example, the successor organizations to what was set up after Rana Plaza have largely run into the sand. What should governments do to help fill that gap? So there's a sort of a joined up approach, that it's not just that companies who are buying from those factories find themselves you know, holding the exploding bomb, but that actually there's a sense of, right, well, actually we can do our bit, but there's other pieces of the equation that need to be done. How does, I'll come to you first on that, Tesla, as you're representing government here. Again, I realize I'm generalizing horribly, but it'd be interesting just to have your thoughts on that.
I think that's a very important aspect of it, and that's why we started these voluntary agreements in 2014. That is a multi-stakeholder agreement where the government is party to the agreement. So our role is to actually do those bilateral talks with other government, with host country governments, and to do our more diplomatic task. I think just to have these discussions with other countries, to get discussions going also on the European level. So that I think is our role to play, and I think it's a very important one and a very valid one, and I think a lot of companies also ask for it. So they tell us, okay, we're supposed to address this issue in the value chain, but it's a systemic issue. We cannot do it on our own. We need other parties there as well. So that's where we play a role. But we also have NGOs and trade unions a part of these agreements, and they also have their own network and their own information, their own role to play. So I think a multi-stakeholder approach is often very valid in this area, because I think all these different actors can play a role in addressing these systemic issues from their own task and from their own organization. So as a government, so we try to have these talks, bilateral talks with Bangladesh or India. We do all these things. Our embassies are very, very active on this topic. So we get them addressing these topics also within their own policy. So I think that's a very important role that we need to play as well. But we see it's also difficult. I mean, as Dutch, we do this because we're part of these voluntary agreements with the sectors as well, also with the NGOs. But I think in other countries, it's a bit more difficult for governments to take up on that role, to be a part of a voluntary agreement. So that's where we need to step it up towards other EU governments to see what the role they can play as well.
Thanks for that. I mean, yes, I can speak to that. I mean, when I was in Bangladesh last, I met your colleagues at the embassy in Dhaka, and yes, they're very much engaged with that. And I think it's that sort of quiet, gentle nudging in the right direction. It's not grand political statements. It's trying to find out where the opennesses are.
It's often behind doors, behind closed doors. So that's also difficult for us, because we do a lot, but it's also difficult to really be transparent about that.
Yeah, Phil, to you.
Yeah, just building on what Tessel says, I think just adding more, putting a little more emphasis on one dimension. Tessel mentioned the role of trade unions and workers' organisations. You know, if we really want to challenge some of the systemic inequalities, which we know drive much of the abuse, then we have to have some attempt to ensure that there is some redistribution, both of income and power in supply chains. It's not going to happen without that. This is a very low wage sector. It's deliberately so. So it's quite a challenge in terms of purchasing practices. But I do think that we've accepted essentially the disenfranchisement and disempowerment. And it is time now for a degree of emancipation of workers in those supply chains, for their voice to be heard. And brands can do that by bringing the voice of those workers into the due diligence process. As I say, if you look at the worker-driven social responsibility models that have been brought out in the last 5-10 years, they really have worked tremendously well to help brands control first of all, sexual abuse of women in supply chains, but also the issue of wages. And so again, I think there's opportunities there for this due diligence to make sure that we are bringing workers in terms of the design, the implementation, and the verification of the due diligence as a partner with the brands and the suppliers.
Elizabeth, to you, I could imagine that there are quite a lot of your clients who are getting quite hot under the collar and saying, we don't cause these problems, why don't the governments do something about it? We can't hear you, Elizabeth.
Sorry. We have certainly heard from some clients a level of frustration if it seems to them that the obligations are mainly being placed on companies to pick up what they think governments should be a bit more bold in addressing. Having said that, I think in general, there is an acknowledgement that companies have an enormous role to play. If companies aren't doing anything to address human rights impacts, that is leaving a huge lacuna in terms of the problems that there are around the world in supply chains, because obviously, unfortunately, these commercial supply chains do quite often lead to these working practices that give rise to human rights violations. So you can't just ignore the impact that companies' operations are having, and similarly the positive impact that can be had where companies try to do the right thing. So if a company, for example, decides it's going to address a human rights risk far down in its supply chain by ensuring that there are correct working practices in its factories, for example, that can have a knock-on effect. If suppliers to large companies in the UK, for example, believe that they're going to lose business over here because they're not complying with or adhering to human rights standards, then, as I said, that could have a snowball effect. So they start to take these issues more seriously, whereas in the past it wasn't really on their radar. So yeah, I think in general there is a wide acknowledgement that companies have a huge role to play, but the governments do need to step in and also, you know, be a driving force behind this.
Okay. Thanks for that. I'll do a shameless plug at this point. Just coming back to Phil's point about addressing imbalances in supply chains. We've been doing some work with in the smallholder sector for the last year, and on the back of that, we're developing something we're calling the Sustainable Commodities Marketplace, which is precisely trying to address that issue. To try and find ways of providing direct traceability, so not mass balance, but direct traceability right to the farm, but also to put small-scale farmers much more in the driving seat, rather than all the power being at the brand and buyer end of the market. So end of shameless plug. But if people want to know more, please get in touch. And it's on the Innovation Forum Innovation Accelerator site if anyone wants to have a look. Coming now to Jana, who has a question. Jana Prosvetov, over to you, Jana. Unmute yourself, and if possible, also turn your camera on so we can see you, and just say who you are.
Good morning. I am not sure that I can. Oh, start video. Here you go.
It's the old start video button.
yeah, that's technology. Good morning from my end. I'm sure good afternoon for everybody, and very excited to be on this call with you. I'm wondering, human rights, obviously a very big topic and very important over the last years. However, there have been other sustainability issues and challenges that apparel brands have started to pay more attention to. not more important than human rights by any means, but they've just prioritized additional things like carbon emissions, water usage, eutrophication, etc. Are there different laws emerging or coming online soon that also focus on these sustainability topics? And if you could talk about what are the, maybe top 3 to 5 that companies need to pay attention to now.
Who wants to start on that? Phil?
Yes, please. It's a very good question, Jana. I think the first thing to say is that much of this, I'm very excited because much of this legislation coming through is human rights and environmental due diligence. And this represents a sea change in the way our lawmakers are thinking about these issues, because increasingly none of us can perceive these issues as distinct. So many human rights issues are environmental issues and vice versa. They're fundamentally indivisible in many circumstances now. And I think that there's therefore a real need for that integration, and it's great to see that happening. At the same time, there are areas of legislation in the environmental sphere which are fundamentally important, such as the Europe's own finance action plan and the green taxonomy, which are both really important adjuncts, I think, to the mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence laws that are coming through. Just to give you one example from our perspective, in terms of energy supply, we have an extraordinary opportunity for apparel to use clean energy, to make a radical shift towards clean energy. And yet, we take up over 800 allegations of abuse a year from around the world on all different topics. The fastest rising sector for allegations of abuse is the renewable energy sector. And so what we're seeing because of that scale of that rising abuse is an equal and opposite reaction from communities, particularly indigenous and rural communities, who are saying, if this means the loss of our nations and of our communities, then there's no deal. So getting a fast and fair transition through to clean energy is fundamentally important for the renewable energy sector itself, but also down the supply chain for the apparel sector and itself, along with all the other sectors that need to use that clean energy. So we're not going to get a fast transition unless it's a fair transition, because there'll be equal and opposite reactions, suspensions of operations, etc. But if we can get human rights embedded in these investment decisions upstream, we will move much faster to that clean energy transition that we all need. And that's why, again, it's so important that the end users, such as the apparel brands, are speaking out about that.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think Phil's exactly right, and this issue of a just transition is something that we've been seeing as well with our clients who are entering into contracts for carbon offsetting, so buying or trading carbon offsetting credits. Obviously, it seems on the face of it to be a purely positive thing if you're sponsoring projects to plant trees, for example, around the world. However, there's an interesting human rights element, which is if you're in a jurisdiction where, for example, the local economy really relies on a piece of land that is now going to be ring-fenced so that a company overseas can use it for carbon offsetting, what impact is that going to have on local communities? Are there going to be unintended negative human rights impacts? So the clients that we're working with who are really front runners in this respect, they're brilliant in that they're saying we want to make sure that when we're entering into this type of contract, so thinking about the climate change element, we're not forgetting about the human rights element. And so they're asking us to check their contracts to make sure they've got correct contractual protections and obligations on suppliers that they're working with, to make sure that in the process they're aligning as closely as possible with the UN guiding principles. So I think it's really important that human rights remains firmly on people's radar and doesn't get lost on the wayside just because people think that what they're doing is very positive by focusing on climate change and sustainability issues.
Yeah. Ethel, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, no, to add to that, I think that's why it's so important that all companies do their proper due diligence. So it's not just the apparel sector or the the food industry, but also the renewable energy sector really needs to have the proper due diligence in place. We've seen that now with the wind energy sector and the solar energy sector in the Netherlands. They're coming more and more in the front in the media on different human rights issues in their supply chains. So they approach us to help them to do their collective due diligence. And I think that's very important that we have an eye on that as well, that it's not just good examples, good sectors that will do beautiful things, but they also have their issues in the value chains, and we need to be very aware of that. So I think that makes it more and more important that we have a good due diligence legislation in place that is environmental, climate change, human rights. It's all very connected. So we cannot just see it in isolation. It's not just human rights are always connected also to climate and to environment.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And I think it's quite useful in some of these things to, it's like old, in essays at university, first define your terms. Make sure we know what we're talking about. But also, I think the fact that these things are interrelated. I think there is often a temptation to try and salami slice in the way which isn't always helpful. Now, coming to a question from Lisa Wustmeyer. Again, if you could. Oh, you've done all that already. You just need to unmute, say who you are, where you're from, and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm Lisa. I'm from Germany. I'm working for the Otto Group, a large retailing company. And I just wanted to refer to what Phil said earlier. If I got it right, you said that we should make sure that the voice of the workers is heard and that this is incorporated into the human rights due diligence process. And I was just wondering if you could give some advice on how exactly this should be done and what the expectations would be, especially with regard to companies having very global and complex supply chains. So obviously we cannot talk to every single workers, but we would need to have a different approach. So I was hoping for some thoughts on that.
Tessel, do you want to start this time?
Sure, yeah, I think it's a very valid question and very difficult to answer as well. That's what we're struggling with within our voluntary approaches and our sectoral agreements, because everybody's asking for this proper stakeholder engagement and engagement of workers. But usually companies need help to really connect with these stakeholders locally. So they know the stakeholders within the Netherlands, but it's very difficult for them to connect with them locally. That's why we have these multi-stakeholder agreements, because then our Dutch labor unions, they have a good network also locally, so they can introduce and use their network to introduce companies with their local labor union. So I think that's one important aspect of what we're doing in the Netherlands. And I think also with that respect, our embassies are playing a role, so they can connect local stakeholders and Dutch companies and create more stakeholder engagement there as well. But yeah, so we're struggling with that as well. So any good pointers by Phil will be useful for me, for me too.
Well, Phil, as it was your comment, I think it behoves you to provide some insight.
Yes, thanks very much, Lisa. I think it's a really, I'm so grateful for the question. The first is this issue of the imbalance of power we see as a core driver of abuse in supply chains. So addressing it is fundamentally important. It can be addressed at a number of different levels. So for instance, right at the top level, at the international level, those global framework agreements that a company can establish with an international trade union that basically can then send messages down through its supply chain, quite explicit messages to say, we are a company that respects workers' rights. We therefore want the freedom of association, workers to be able to come together and organise in order for their voice to be heard legitimately alongside that in a negotiation with the companies that we are purchasing from. And that sends, first of all, a message of permission down to workers to start to think, well, hang on, maybe we could start to get together, because so many of the messages that they've received over the last 40 years have been lessons of prohibition, that you will be sanctioned, you will lose your job if you are not if you seek to form a union. So shifting that message is fundamentally important. Secondly, I think the companies themselves can really work with suppliers by building closer relationships with those suppliers and training those suppliers also in the way in which they can benefit from that worker engagement. You know, I always say, if you don't know if you're not speaking to workers, you don't know where the bodies are buried in your supply chain. Because the workers know, because they work alongside these people. I'll give you one example. You know, the Syrian refugees in the apparel supply chain. The message we got when we went out to 37 companies was we have no refugees in our supply chain. We went there and we arrived to Turkey, and we arrived the day of the emergency. It took us us and the Panorama, BBC Panorama, about 24 hours to find large numbers of refugees working in the apparel supply chains, in conditions of half the minimum wage, in conditions of day contracting, etc., and significant sexual abuse of women. So it's not hard. Once you want to know these things, engaging with workers will tell you a great deal more. And of course, just that other message about bringing workers into the very design of your own due diligence approaches, so that workers can help the company inform the way the company is going to implement that and verify it. And so I think those are just a quick smattering of ideas.
Thanks, Phil. Elizabeth, how do you, because obviously this isn't, you know, how do you engage at country level is perhaps something which a London-based law firm is not terribly well equipped to do, that and brain surgery. So what sort of, what is the advice you would give clients in terms of who else they need to be talking to? You know, obviously, because this is all about sort of everyone, you know, playing their appropriate role. And as you've said already, that what you can do is to point out the legal challenge that they potentially face. But what other advice do you suggest that your clients seek in terms of addressing the sorts of issues that both Tesla and Phil have talked about?
So I think in terms of making sure workers or stakeholders' voices are being heard, there's quite often in the negotiation periods before a project starts, or when you're just entering into a new relationship with a new supplier, for example, I think quite often counterparties will say, yes, of course, we will check in with stakeholders, and of course, we will listen to workers, etc. So from a legal perspective, I'd say that something that's very worthwhile doing is to make sure that you've embedded those provisions within your contracts with those suppliers. So obviously, at the outset, you might want to include provisions saying you will engage with stakeholders and you will carry out human rights due diligence. But think a few steps ahead, a few years ahead. So do you want them to be reporting on a biannual or annual basis about what they've been doing actively to engage with stakeholders? Do you want to be presented with a report demonstrating how they've been doing that? Do you want to have the right to audit what they've been doing? Do you want the right to even be able to visit a project or a factory where there's either been allegations or just on an ad hoc basis, so that you can satisfy yourself further up the supply chain that yes, actually things are being done to your standards, and you're not just relying on the people on the ground. So that's certainly something we've been doing a lot more of in the last few years. But otherwise it is difficult because, you know, these supply chains are often huge. So there are so many different suppliers and steps between a garment being manufactured, for example, and then what's happening in the UK with the buyers. So that's just one way that I would suggest that clients think about those risks, to think further ahead and make sure that in the next couple of years they have the rights to step in if they need to, and make sure things are being done properly.
Yeah, I think that's extremely good advice, actually. It's making sure, it's like everything else, I suppose, it's making sure it's woven into the way in which they run their business on a day-to-day basis, rather than it being the sort of the thing they worry about at the back end of a Friday afternoon. And yes, and I suppose the fact that if they do it more, then they get better at it. So I think that's very solid advice. Now, we've got time probably for one more question. So going over to Nausicaa, who I think has a question, if you still want to ask it.
Hello, hi. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here. I was just very interested in hearing what the panelists recommend in terms of what can governments impose as incentives for companies to follow these due diligence laws. So what can we include perhaps in legislation or just overall, what are the incentives you're seeing that are proving to be best practices and successful? Thank you.
Probably most appropriate to go to Tessel here, as it's a question specifically about government.
Yeah, so we impose a different type of measures. So public procurement, I think, is a one important one. I think Phil already mentioned it as well. So our buyers' practices should be good as well. So that's a good incentive for companies to adhere to the OECD guidelines or do their due diligence. We also set some criteria, for example, for participating in trade missions or making use of government instruments. So companies need to adhere to the OECD guidelines for them to join trade missions or to make use of our instruments. So I think that's a good way to give incentives as well. But it's also just to support them. So I think these agreements that we have are a way to get companies to implement the OECD guidelines and to really do their due diligence. So I think it's a combination of different measures. So it's not just one, it's not just legislation and then just say to them, okay, you just do what you need to do and we'll get back to you when we have our when we have it in place. So I think it's really it's a mixture of different measures that we need to have in place for companies to have proper incentives, but also to be supported. So for us, that's the mixture, basically.
Okay, thanks, Tessel. Now, Elizabeth and Phil, very briefly, as we're down to our last sort of minute and a half. So, Elizabeth, you first, and then Phil.
I think two things very briefly. First of all is issuing adequate guidance as to what is expected of companies. This is all it's quite new, this area of law. So taking the Modern Slavery Act, for example, there's been a lot of uncertainty amongst clients as to who actually has to comply with it and what exactly they have to do. So the more guidance the government can issue in that respect, the easier companies will find to comply with it. The second thing is making this information more publicly accessible. So again, going back to the Modern Slavery Act, something that we're expecting to see introduced in the next year is the government setting up this public repository of modern slavery statements. So I think the more that is in the public eye, the more companies are going to be incentivized to comply with their obligations and to make sure they're doing it right.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And Phil, last but not least.
Yeah, literally, the FT today covers the fact that President Biden has introduced a new executive order insisting that all government contracts now have to ensure that the company is paying a living wage, which is double the current minimum wage in the United States. That's an extraordinary incentive because government, even though it shrunk slightly in economies, is still around 30% of GDP in most advanced states. That's an extraordinary incentive for every company to really start to do the right thing. If they're excluded from those products and selling those products and services to the state. You've also got export credit guarantees, which are another significant subsidy to companies, which should not, in my opinion, be available to companies that do not comply with the international conventions that our government has signed up to, such as the ILO conventions. And then I agree very much with Tessel about the idea of trade missions, including those that have genuinely signed up to the conventions and are delivering on the conventions which the government is part of. It's just part of coherence across government, I think. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Phil. I think that's a very good place to end, that it's easy to focus on one tool in these things, in this case, the due diligence legislation. But I think really the message from everything our speakers have said today is that has to be seen as part of a much wider toolkit of approaches which need to be used. So given we're now slightly beyond time, I'll draw this session to a close. And so thank you to all the attendees for spending the last hour or so with us. I hope we provided decent entertainment. But particularly thank you to speakers Elizabeth, Phil and Tessel for some really, really thoughtful insights and bring their expertise to the table. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.